Welcome to Proudly Jewish, Conversations on Israel and Jewish Identity. I'm Cantor Eyal Bitton, Cantor of Congregation Neve Shalom in Portland, Oregon. And my very special guest today is Professor Nancy Harrowitz. And she's the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies at Boston University, as well as the director of a new program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. She's written on the confluence of antisemitism and misogyny in the 19th century, as well as on Italian Jewish authors such as Giorgio Bassani, Primo Levi, and Carlo Levi. Her most recent book is Primo Levi and the Identity of a Survivor. What's interesting for what we're going to be talking about today is she served as the chair of the Working Group on Antisemitism and Anti-Israeli Harassment at Boston University this past semester. Nancy, welcome to Proudly Jewish. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
When October 7th happened, I was looking, and I started this podcast a few weeks afterwards. I was looking at the various issues that were arising in the Jewish community that many of them, people that I knew, including members of my congregation, wanted answers to or wanted to explore or address. And some of that was the growing anti-Semitism around them. And some of them, it was the echoes of the Holocaust that were triggered by what they had just seen with October 7th. So you're at Boston University. You were dealing as the chair of this group that's addressing anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism. Can you talk to me a little bit about the nature of anti-Semitism on campus, at least from your perspective?
Sure. Anti-Semitism is, of course, has always been present everywhere, pretty much. Whether or not how covert it is, how obvious it is another question. Since October 7th, anti-Semitic incidents rose on campus, largely as a response to pro-Palestinian protests and Students for Justice in Palestine who have a chapter on our campus. Often students didn't understand the difference between saying things like global intifada and free Palestine, that they think that's all fine because they were given materials by the National Organization of Students for Justice in Palestine and other groups. Some Jewish students got posters put on their dorm rooms. Some Jewish students had hostage posters removed from their dorm rooms. There was one incident in which a student was ripping down posters of the hostages in the student union and was filmed doing this, and it started quite a controversy. It became very unfortunate after a while because then she was doxxed, which I don't believe is ever appropriate for anyone. And I'm afraid that there are people out there who are wanting to support Israel that get carried away and do things that are really not civil. And so she ended up in the middle of kind of a mess. And she was Jewish herself, which is part of the reason for the doxing. Our campus has been much quieter than other campuses. We never had encampments. We did have a fair number of protests. There was a die-in for Gaza in the student union that the BU police they were keeping a very close eye on it, but they didn't stop it.
Right.
Some of the student groups were hanging posters from university buildings, which is against the student conduct code. So there definitely were some things that happened. There was Free Palestine written on the BU Hillel rabbi's office window, which was considered a hate crime by the state of Massachusetts because it's considered a house of worship. Other than that, not a lot happened on campus. Some incidences in classrooms with professors taking sides very vocally to their students, even though the class didn't have anything to do with the Middle East. I think that was happening everywhere. So it wasn't as bad as other campuses, I can say that. Right. One reason that it wasn't as bad is because the interim president, Ken Freeman, and the interim provost, Ken Luchin, who is Jewish, took immediate steps to communicate with all of the student groups all the time. So they were having meetings with Students for Justice in Palestine and Hillel Students for Israel, BU Hillel Students for Israel, once a month separately. But they were really keeping their finger on the pulse of what was going on in campus. And students often just want to be heard. They want
Right.
their concerns heard on any side. And so that helped a lot, I think. We also have a very strong Hillel at BU. Sometimes, to be frank, their approach was a little bit dogmatic, so that they didn't like any protest having to do with Palestine, whereas I feel that a lot of them are fine. It just depends on the language that's being used
Right.
and on the tone. And I would never want to see free speech suppressed. The interim president set up 3 working groups. One was on Islamophobia and anti-Arab discrimination, the harassment discrimination. The other was on anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli harassment and discrimination. And both groups were charged with having members from many different areas of campus, so a wide perspective would be represented at the meetings. We all wrote reports. And a third group called Moving Forward, which was how to have civil discourse on campus when there are different points of view that right now are really, really emotional.
They're
And
hot button.
yeah,
They're emotional. Yes, they're triggering for so many people.
yes,
It goes to the core of people's identity as well, not just their ideology, right?
yes.
Now you mentioned about how, in your view, the administration's attentiveness to the issue right from the start may have mitigated the severity or the tone of the protests. And that's not obviously that's not a model that's been followed across the board in the U.S. or Canada, and to the detriment of so many students and to their reputations in terms of the schools. But just to clarify, you mentioned about the working groups that were started at Boston U. Whose initiative? I'm on the outside. I don't know how things work. Who brought that? Was that the ground up? Was it top down?
Oh,
How
it's
did
top down. It
top
was
down?
the interim president
Okay.
who wanted us to stay as peaceful as possible, and he
Right.
took some very smart moves in order to make that happen.
Okay.
So he pointed all of us, the head of the Islamophobia group and I worked together. We met with the president and sometimes the provost every 2 weeks the entire semester to discuss how things were going, to
Right.
discuss any interim recommendations we might have, to discuss the reports that we were charged to produce by the end of June when the new president was coming in. We also met with the new president, who was
Right.
very supportive of these groups and happy to hear that we'd been doing this.
The bottom line is of what you said in terms of the severity of what we've seen at Boston U is that it wasn't to the degree of some other campuses, right? It was not to that
Right.
level. And that's a positive thing. But you also said earlier that anti-Semitism increased post October 7th.
Yes, absolutely. It became much more out in the open, but so did Islamophobia.
I
So
see.
there were Muslim students who were suffering too. And when we found out they did not have a full-time imam on campus to attend to their spiritual needs, Mohammed and I were pushing for that. So the
Who's,
university would hire somebody, and now they're in the process of doing it because that's just not fair.
you said Muhammad and I. Who's Muhammad again?
Mohammed Zaman is he was the chair of the group on Islamophobia and anti-Arab discrimination.
Understand. Okay, I understand.
So we
Well,
work together on really pushing for this, and also for Muslim studies, because that is needs a lot of boosting at BU, whereas Jewish studies is very strong.
right. And have you heard from the Hillels, or I say Hillels, like it's multiple, but Hillel itself, or the students that will go there to get their sentiment about how they feel about the anti-Semitism? For example, that the young woman you mentioned who had that incident, obviously she had an incident, and she'll have a negative story to recount. Overall, what are you hearing from the students, the Jewish students?
Well, since they found out early on that I was the chair of the working group, and they know that I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center, as soon as I would appear at Hillel,
Yeah.
because I was invited to many Shabbat dinners this past semester, I would hear all kinds of stories that were not being reported. So that was an issue. At one point, the Hillel was actually inviting the higher administration to come to Shabbat and give talks before the Friday night dinners. And at one point, the president was there. And these students had just told me the story about a teaching assistant in, I believe, a chemistry class who was really harassing them for being Jewish. in
Wow.
subtle but obnoxious ways. So I went and spoke to Ken and said, these students just told me this story. Do you want to come over and hear it? And he said, sure. So, because they refused to report it. They were
Yeah.
afraid of retaliation, which is still a problem. So they told him the story. He was outraged, as was I. And it was like, that a teaching assistant, anybody at the university who are saying things like this to Jewish students can't actually get away with it. There
Yeah.
are sanctions. There are things that can happen. But the students have to report them or we don't know about them. So one of the recommendations of my group is to set up a much better reporting system. Right now, complaints would go to the dean of students office. They didn't really know how to handle them. Why should they? I mean, they've never really been in this position before for either the Muslim students or the Jewish students. So we need a much better reporting system that has some teeth to it. It needs to be confidential for the student, but it needs to have some action at the end.
Yeah.
That was probably our strongest recommendation to the president's office, was to put something in place.
When did this group start? The working group that you're chair of?
The end of January. I was
This-
asked at the beginning of January to do it.
Okay. Who's on this committee and how did, or yeah, committee for lack of a better, this group, how is that decided? I don't need specific names, but
Right.
what's the approach to, was it you as the chair who assembled the group or?
Yes, they
Oh,
said, okay, Nancy, go ahead and find members from the 16 colleges that BU has.
I see.
We need faculty, we need students, we need graduate students, and we need staff and undergraduates. I'm like, okay, is this going to be a committee of 100? So I tried to narrow it down. We ended up with 14, which was not too bad a number. There was an Israeli professor from the law school who was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
There was someone from the School of Social Work who represented a very different view than some of us. I wouldn't say all of us. He's very anti-Zionist. And so it actually became quite the challenge to discuss everything peacefully within our group.
Right.
And it got very interesting. We all learned a lot from each other in the end. It stayed peaceful, which was
Wow.
good. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What you're not saying, what you're saying in different words is it's not a given that it would be peaceful.
No.
And the fact that it was, I don't know if it's a testament to your leadership or the professionalism and maturity of those people that were assembled in this group. Either way, whatever it was, you'll take it.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Especially when it came to a definition of anti-Semitism that we recommended to the university. That was controversial because, as you know, IRA is controversial. The Jerusalem Declaration is controversial. There really isn't a definition of anti-Semitism that isn't controversial because some of them protect Israelis and some of them do not. And so that was really quite an issue that it took us a while to work out.
I can imagine. I'm a fan of the IRA definition, and I'm not at Boston U. I'm not in the campuses. I'm not seeing what you're seeing. But having a definition it's hard. It's hard not to. It's hard. Well, let's go back a little bit. I have encountered so many people, particularly non-Jewish people, who don't know what anti-Semitism is actually. They think they do, and they don't. I mean, that's got to have been why you felt you had to have a definition.
Yeah, we felt that it would be useful for the Title VI officer at BU and for the Dean of Students and for whatever reporting system was set up.
Did you find that, a lot of the students are young, they don't always know things. That's why they're learning. But have you been surprised, shocked, not surprised, not shocked that some staff members or adults who have experienced, who didn't have a firm understanding of what anti-Semitism was, or a nuanced understanding?
Yes, the word nuance is really important.
Okay.
And gets left behind, I would say, just about all the time. People want to put everything into a binary opposition. It's one or the other. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work for anything, but it especially doesn't work in this situation. One thing that the Hillel did, which was really wonderful, Rabbi Eagle, who is the CEO of that organization, put together training sessions for administrators. So he had 3 sessions of an hour and a half each to teach people all over campus what anti-Semitism is.
Yeah.
I went to 2 of them because I was interested to see what what he was doing. It was great. People were learning a lot, and
Yeah.
they admitted their ignorance a lot because it was a safe space to do so.
Okay.
So he's planning on continuing that this fall and
Okay.
reaching out to deans, to assistant provosts, to assistant deans, uh, all kinds of administrators all over campus, so that the level of education about what anti-Semitism is would go up.
Yeah. Going back to your group itself, the existence of your group, I'm just thinking about, why doesn't everybody create such a group? Not that it solves everything, but you certainly stand a better chance if you're, but what I was going to get at is that, okay, you can have a group, but the group sometimes it's not a given that that group has teeth. It's not just that it's a good committee, a good group of people that can work together. But once you have thoughts, ideas, plans, initiatives, whatever that may be that the committee comes up with, you have to have a result at the end, an action, some sort of end goal. Well, there must have been from the very top sincere support for this group.
There absolutely was. And the new president is also expressing a lot of support. I had a 1 hour meeting with her right before flying out to Oregon, and she's very supportive. She really wants
Yeah.
peace on campus. She wants students to feel heard. She wants free speech, but she doesn't want hate speech. And
Right.
that's kind of where you have to draw the line. And then another issue with trying to do something about hate speech is who defines what hate speech is, right?
Yeah.
That's a really big issue, actually.
Yeah.
But she was pretty well informed about anti-Semitism.
That's excellent. And
Yeah.
now, but you just raised another topic which I was very much on my mind, especially right now, and particularly about the younger generation. The idea of having people get along who have differences of opinion was a given for me growing up in the 70s and 80s. I'm still growing up in some ways, but particularly, the child in the 70s as a teenager in the 80s, and it's not a given today. So many students are extremely offended by differences of opinion and seek to do harm sometimes. I don't mean physically, but sometimes physically, but online, bashing and whatever for someone who has a difference of opinion. The opinion threatens me, triggers me, and I can't hear it. Is that generational? Would you concur that there's a bit more of that today? And if so, is that contributing to the atmosphere of people feeling being intolerant, I suppose, of others and their perspectives? Can you sort of expand on that?
Yes, absolutely. So it'd be very easy to say this new generation has this problem, and it's called entitlement. And with entitlement comes the belief that your opinion is the most important opinion, and so on. It's far too simplistic. I know a lot of students at BU, many students who have taken my small seminars, who really are not that way, or they might have started out a little bit that way, but being in a small seminar discussing difficult topics was great for them because they were hearing points of view that they wouldn't have agreed with at the beginning, and then they start seeing, well, for one thing, that the face of that differing opinion is now humanized by the fact that they're sitting in a seminar room discussing with them.
Right.
That's really important.
Right.
So when I teach Holocaust studies courses, I always talk about other minorities and other groups. In fact, in my course called Representations of the Holocaust in Literature and Film, I've been teaching the film 12 Years a Slave ever since it came out.
Okay.
And the effect of that is really astonishing. The first time I taught it, I was a little nervous, like, are the students going to think I'm crazy for throwing this in at the end of the semester in a course on Holocaust film? But what happened was the students started relating much more to the material on the Holocaust that they've been reading and viewing, because they suddenly saw that the issues were universal. Dehumanization is universal. Dehumanization has happened in many places, in many genocides, in slavery in particular. And so all of a sudden they were connecting the dots in a way that they really hadn't completely before, because when you're studying Holocaust studies, it's easy to keep an arm's length from the material. In fact, you kind of have to protect your own mental health, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, it all came crashing down to earth for them. And I always teach it, I have to say, at the end of the semester. It wouldn't work at the beginning. It has to be at the very end.
Why is that?
We're just astonished by the connections
And why wouldn't it work at the beginning?
because they need to learn about the Holocaust first.
Okay,
So,
what happened, what happened, what happened, and then here's
yes.
the link. Okay.
Well, it's more like what happened, what happened, what happened. How's it represented? We're reading this piece of
Yeah.
literature on it, this memoir, this fictive piece, these documentaries, and these feature films.
Yeah.
And then we get to 12 Years a Slave. So they see a whole bunch of things. They see how slavery is being represented through a feature film. And I point out the historical inaccuracies of that film, which there are,
Yeah.
and the strengths of it, which are tremendous. And they really get it on a different level. So that to me has been an important piece of teaching Holocaust studies, and that increased since October 7th.
Okay.
And I don't always teach 12 Years a Slave. I teach a course called The Holocaust Through Film, in which I do not teach 12 Years a Slave, but we discuss these issues.
So, for years, it seems to me that the philosophy, the approach in Jewish education was, or by the Jewish community was, if we teach our community, but also the non-Jewish community, non-Jewish kids, about the Holocaust, this will help combat anti-Semitism. And I think that many Jews that I know of and that I've come across have been a bit of a deer, like deer in headlights by the explosion of anti-Semitism since October 7th. And I would imagine that there's multiple reasons for it, but it would disprove, or it would be a counter argument to the effectiveness of that idea that Holocaust education will lead to a decrease in anti-Semitism. Have we been teaching? I don't want to say have we been teaching the Holocaust wrong, but was that idea wrong? Was the idea that, hey, by teaching Holocaust education, we will inform people about anti-Semitism and they'll stop being anti-Semitic?
So
What failed?
we brought Dara Horn to
Yeah.
campus, and she gave a very powerful talk in which she said it was about this exact issue. She said, "No, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really work. Students learn about it, adults learn about it, and it's too distant for them," which is precisely why I believe that Holocaust studies have to be taught in a more universalizing way, in which you talk about other genocides, you talk about other groups. It reaches them on a deeper level, and they see the universal applicability of the topic, such as dehumanization. They
Yeah.
see it in a different way. It isn't something that happened to some other group. It's something that could happen to them. It's something that could happen in their country. I had a student from China, international student, who wanted a private conversation with me at one point during my office hours because she was so shocked about things she'd heard about in China and didn't fully understand until she studied the Holocaust.
Oh, that's interesting.
So you make an impact like that, that's a
Yeah.
deep and lasting impact. It's
Yeah.
not a topic they can hold at arm's length anymore.
It's an interesting idea, the universal versus the particular. And I remember when I was 21, I think, yeah, and I did my trip to Europe. I'm in university. I was at McGill, and I went for a summer, backpacking through parts of Europe. And one time I went to Amsterdam, and I was, among the other places I visited, I went to the Anne Frank house, the Anne Frank Museum. And it was very moving to be in that space. And I left feeling very dissatisfied,
Hmm.
and I was on the verge of upset. And this is for anyone doing math. It was 1991. I don't know what they've done with the museum since, but why I left there with a bad taste in my mouth was that I felt they had universalized it too much. I felt that there was nothing, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my memory is that this was they were trying to show a young girl, here's where she lived, she faced hate, and that was the takeaway. That's my takeaway from, after decades. How do you have that balance between universalizing and being particular? And I don't know if you've seen the Anne Frank house, if you want to comment on that or not, but
No,
okay.
I haven't yet. It's actually on my list of things I'd like to do. So do you know about the controversy at the Anne Frank house a few years ago? They insisted one of their employees not wear his kippah?
No.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Wow.
That's why I started kind of laughing when you started talking about Anne
I
Frank house,
see.
because that's just that just I can't even wrap my head around that. They
Yeah.
don't want their employee to look too Jewish. Is that it? At the Anne
Wow.
Frank house, really? And so that demonstrates exactly what you're talking about, this over secularization, this
Right.
over universalizing, trying to appeal to everybody and weakening the whole thing so much there's no depth left.
Mm,
Now, I don't know what they're doing now.
yeah.
It could be that this has changed dramatically. I don't want to be trashing the Anne Frank house. It's a
Right.
really important place. It's an important museum. But it does raise these questions if you over universalize what happens.
With the Jewish community, have we done, I don't know if you can address the following. Have we done a good enough job of teaching our youth about anti-Semitism? And what I mean by that is not the history of it, but
Mhm.
existence of it. You said earlier on in our conversation that anti-Semitism was existed in campuses prior to October 7th and has grown since October 7th. I am under the impression that many students growing up in America and in Canada, I'm Canadian, felt that they lived in a post-anti-Semitic world. I don't mean that they didn't feel like didn't exist at all, but the impact on their lives was almost nil. And in fact, they were on, if they had to pick a category, they might define themselves as being even privileged.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, they've been
okay,
living in a bubble, I have to say. And
that's
I've
the
met
word I
a
was going to
lot of them.
use.
They've been living in a bubble.
Yeah.
I know a lot of colleagues and a lot of students who feel that way. And that actually has been an issue with the anti-Semitism on campus because some of them are so surprised. Whereas it doesn't surprise me because I grew up in Portland. I grew up in Portland in
Yeah.
an anti-Semitic neighborhood.
Oh,
My siblings experienced anti-Semitism at the local grade school. I did too from a neighbor,
wow.
which is one of the reasons I'm in the field I'm in,
Hmm.
actually. So I've never been able to have my head in the sand about it.
Wow. It's interesting. Portland, at least today, has a reputation of whether it's accurate or not, of being so progressive that it tolerates. It's the wrong word for it, but it is inclusive of everyone, and that's, I suppose, not quite accurate, is it?
Well, this was a long time
Yes.
ago,
Okay.
a very long time ago.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Eastmoreland has changed a lot since then.
Yeah.
I gave a talk at Reed College about 10 or 12 years ago, which is right on the edge of Eastmoreland and a college I know very well from being a high schooler and hanging around there all the time. And it was very meaningful to me to give a talk on Primo Levi at Reed College when I'd grown up just a few blocks away and experienced all of this as a
Yeah.
child.
With Holocaust studies at university, have is there any impact of October 7th on the future of Holocaust studies? Is there any connection? Is there anyone in the academic world saying, hey, I have to teach us this way or that way or include something else? Is there anything going on in that respect?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
I can speak to what we're doing at the Elie Wiesel Center.
Yeah.
Since we started this new program, and you'll note the title, Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies.
Hmm.
And that was to create a big tent so that I have students majoring in this who need to take a couple of courses on the Holocaust when they might be more interested in Rwanda,
Hmm.
right? Or in human rights in somewhere else. So
Okay.
they're now being exposed to a lot of classes, different kinds of classes they wouldn't take otherwise. So I think it's actually really important that we've created this kind of Big Ten effect for that new major. Um, what else can I say about that? In terms of what we're doing at the center, I became director 2 years ago, and one of my goals has been to expand the center. So we have a new minor in Israel studies, which is starting this fall. We had a donor donate $100,000 a year for 10 years to create new classes in Jewish studies. So I'm happily finding colleagues and getting them to create new classes in Jewish studies, which I'm really excited about.
Is there a sense of direction to that, or is it just why new? What's not working
Well,
in
we
the
don't
past?
offer that. It's not that we don't, we have a couple of courses in Jewish studies, but these are going to be new courses. So one of them will be Introduction to Jewish History.
Hmm.
One of them will be the Jews of Latin America. We don't
Uh-huh.
have such a course. The donor felt that it was very, very important for all students to take a Jewish history course to understand the importance of the Jews in world civilization, and I can't disagree with that.
Right.
So we now have the funds to do a lot more of this. I'm also trying to fundraise for a chair, an endowed chair in Holocaust and genocide studies or in Jewish studies. We haven't, or Israel studies. We haven't decided quite which way to go. It depends on whatever donors we find. So I'm adding new classes every year to what we offer. And now we have very, very strong programs. They're getting
Yeah.
stronger by the minute. There is a lot of support from donors right now about Jewish studies, to wit, the donor we just got a few months ago. And there
Is
are
your
other donors out there.
is your sense that this is happening across the board in the States at universities, or
No,
it's not happening, or you don't know?
no, I'm saying that's not happening. The reason it's not happening is because several of these universities have done serious missteps when it comes to
Mm.
controlling civil discourse on campus, and their donors are fleeing.
Right.
And Columbia,
Yeah.
Harvard. I mean, you know, the major players have really
Yeah.
gotten into a lot of trouble this year over their refusal to deal with these issues,
Yes.
basically.
Yes.
So I think some donors are looking at a place like Boston University as an ideal place to give funds to, because we're so strong in Jewish studies. We have this new minor in Israel studies, and we're really moving ahead with expanding our educational offerings, which of course is the key to having students who understand the nuances of the situation in the Middle East, of anti-Semitism in general,
Yeah.
and of the world we're living in right now.
Now, speaking of Middle East and Israel and Holocaust and anti-Semitism, you know, as I said, I started this podcast 3 weeks, I believe, right after October 7th. And, you know, one of the things that people were saying, and there's a podcast out there, there's some articles about this, that never again is now. And there was, the idea, the specter of the Holocaust was raised among many within the Jewish conscience after on October 7th. And one thought I had was, hey, this means that every Holocaust museum in the world needs to add a new wing or a new exhibit that connects October 7th. And there are those who caution about making a parallel to the Holocaust. And one more thing I'll say before I guess I turn it over to you to get your input. Some people have said we're living in pre-war Germany right now with the rise of anti-Semitism in in North America. And one person, I forget who it was, said we are pre-war Germany, but we're not. We're like 1933 or something like this, which means that we can do something. Is there a parallel? Is it fair for people to create that? And if not, what is it about what happened on October 7th that makes that connection between Holocaust and October 7th?
First of all, I don't think it's a very good parallel to talk
Yeah.
about 1930s Germany and what's happening now. For one thing, we don't have a dictator. There's a dictator who wants to win office, but we don't have a dictator yet.
Okay.
So the fact that Kamala Harris is getting so much support shows me that people are not as passive and inactive as those German citizens in the 1930s who thought that Hitler was just a crazy person, a lot of them, and he'd go away and nothing would happen, right? I don't think people have their heads in the sand to that degree, except perhaps some of the right-wing supporters. I think they actually do have their heads in the sand. But at any rate, I don't think it's a good parallel. That's one reason. I don't actually think it's the right question. The right question is, how do we fight rising fascism and rising anti-Semitism and rising racism? Because they're all linked. They're always linked, those three. How do we fight that here? How do we fight it abroad? What does it mean that Italy has a prime minister who is on the side of fascism, and Le Pen in France winning so much support? What does it mean that those kinds of movements are getting support again only 80 years after the end of the war?
Right.
Did no one ever learn a lesson about anything? It's chilling to me. But I also feel at the same time, like I said, that people are not as asleep as they were. And that we've had so much progress with legislating rights for minorities, for example, that I don't think there's any going back to something like 1930s Germany. As much as that parallel was kind of tempting at the beginning.
Just to throw this in, I'm a Canadian. I don't vote in the American election and all that. But I remember seeing just a bit of the RNC convention that they had, and I was moved when I have no idea what the speech is, no idea about what. So I'm not commenting on all that. But when there was a bring them home chant from the public, and a bit of a prayer for them. Uh, this is not something that you would have had, whatever we might think of this is not an environment that you would see in Nazi Germany
Right.
prior to the Holocaust. Even on, it seems like across the board, there are some allies that the Jews have. It's not as bleak. And so I'm echoing or trying to concur with your assessment that that it's not exactly right before the Holocaust. It's not, the parallels don't there's not it's not fair to create a parallel. We have more support than we did then in terms of people who have influence and power and who are in government, and that's got to be reassuring. That being said, to me, what the trigger was for the Holocaust was, and I'm not asking this in order to engage an entire podcast episode about this, but the intent of the Hamas terrorists resembled, oh my gosh, there's an intent to do great harm to a people and to our people, and given the chance, what else could this lead to? And we hadn't seen a massacre of our people this big and this intimate since then. So there's the trigger for many people, in our minds as to why that specter was raised. But I hear you. It's like, calm down. This is not good, what's happening with anti-Semitism, but we're not in Germany in the 30s.
Right. And also, people are asking the wrong questions. It's the wrong question to ask.
Yeah.
And when you mention the RNC
Yeah.
and their support of Israel, one has to be a little cynical about this
Okay.
because it's been made very clear why some Republican politicians are supporting Israel very vocally. Is it because they really support Jews, or is it because they want the Jewish vote? Do they want the more to the right Jewish vote that believes that for whom Israel is a single issue? And if a politician doesn't support Israel, they're out no matter what their other platform is, other parts of their platform. And look at what happened with the Republican grilling of those college presidents. I mean, that was a clearly politically manipulative move on their part. Did they really care that much? I kind of doubt it. I think they saw that as a political opportunity to get votes from Jews. So I do think we have to be a little cynical about this, as much as I love the idea of hearing people chant, bring them home. I mean, that's wonderful, but what's behind it, right? And then what about the role of Christian fundamentalism that believes that the Jews are just kind of holding Israel for them, right? And then at the end of the days, it's going to be theirs.
Right. And my perspective is different from yours in this respect, where I feel that if someone wants to be an ally to us, I think eyes wide open, and I'll accept your friendship eyes wide open. And this is the subject of an entirely other podcast, because there's so many other topics that this is touching upon, about what is allyship, how do we, where do we get our support, what's the right steps as a Jewish community that wants to see Israel continue to exist as be part of our lives. But here's a segue. The idea of Israel being part of our lives as Jews. There are some people like me who grew up feeling a connection to Israel from day one, from birth. The idea that this is part of my Jewish identity, this homeland, this ancestral homeland. And I've got a Moroccan parent and an Ashkenazi parent, and the idea of commonality between cultures that were separated by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in some ways, that we still are one people, was something. And where do we emanate from? That's something that was part of my identity from the start. And there are plenty of Jews in America, I find in particular, who weren't brought up that way, who didn't feel that sort of connection. Do you feel that October 7th, certainly with the kids that you're seeing, young adults, I suppose, you're seeing at university campuses, that October 7th and the ensuing wave of anti-Semitism has made them look or re-examine their Jewish identity?
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, I think it's backfired in that a lot of these students who were brought up on Zionism are rejecting it because they feel that they have a certain level of self-righteousness going on, and they don't want to be identifying with what they are seeing, what's being presented to them as the wrong side from a human rights perspective. And then we have films like Israelism that's making the rounds. Have you seen Israelism?
I have not, and I'm not eager to see it because of everything I've heard, but I think I owe it to myself to be informed.
Yeah, I had to. I absolutely had to, because groups were bringing it to campus, other groups were screaming about it. I found out some of the groups who were screaming about it hadn't seen it. And as an academic, I feel like you really actually have to know what you're talking about. They were reading other people's assessments. And so I saw it, and I saw the problems with it. The filmmakers really were seduced, I think, by the human rights questions, which of course are there in Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. There's no question about that. But they took the pro-Zionist attitudes and engagements they'd gone through as children going to Sunday school, etc., as a way of saying, well, yes, we had all of that, but really they're hiding all this from us. They're hiding this terrible treatment of the Palestinians, which is frankly also mostly true. And so they kind of went the other direction. And the film is really pretty propagandistic and very anti-Zionist, and it's had a tremendous effect. It is out there. So I know Elie Wiesel because he's the son of Elie Wiesel, for whom the center is named. And I wrote to him at one point and said, we got to find a filmmaker to make a film that combats this. Right. That hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Because Israelism is being shown everywhere. And no, I asked the person who was presenting at BU to read my critique, which he did not at the showing. I couldn't go because we had an event at the center that I really couldn't skip. So it's been a problem, frankly, that kind of advocacy that is kind of blindly anti-Zionist without really understanding what's at stake.
Yes. And what is at stake?
All this propaganda.
And what is at stake?
Well, okay, so you have groups yelling from the river to the sea. And of course, all the jokes about they don't know what river, they don't know what sea. I mean, it seems pretty innocuous, except that the original Arabic says, from the river to the sea will be Arab. What does that tell you about the intent of that chant? Do they know this? No, they don't. So they're running around chanting it. They don't know it. They're being used. I mean, Hamas has been playing a long game, a long propaganda game for decades now, and they're winning, is how I feel about it. They're winning. They're winning over more and more people to be anti-Zionist without really understanding what the stakes are and what that eventually would mean. Yeah. And it's very disturbing, frankly. So we do our best on campus to educate. What else can we do?
Yeah. Now you said it backfired. Is that what you meant in this respect, or were you also referring to that Jewish identity by some students has grown in some way, or that's not what you meant? Have the attacks on Jews have you seen that sort of not emboldened but strengthen their identity? Or
yes, I've seen both ways. I've seen people run away in shame, and I think there's a shame legacy going on among a lot of anti-Zionists that just don't want to be associated with anything that smacks of violation of human rights. I know one person on campus, one colleague, who says, I'm a proud Jew, and that's why I'm an anti-Zionist. Being an anti-Zionist reflects my Jewish values.
Interesting that, and this is also another entirely other topic, but for me, I look at the Palestinian side and their leadership that has gross violations of human rights towards their own people. You say the wrong thing. I mean, there are videos that recently that I saw of just the most brutal attacks on Palestinians who tried to take humanitarian aid, and Hamas was wanted it for themselves, and just for their own benefit and to sell in the black market. And what they did to these poor individuals was just horrendous. And it's case after case, treatment of LGBTQ and what have you. And what we see, and what I see in terms of it from on the pro-Palestinian side is not shame, is not we can do better, not in our name. We don't see that. And hats off to those Jews that want to see better for humanitarian, in terms of conduct and all that. But consider what is at stake, as you said before. It's like, is the goal to improve the record and to improve treatment of Palestinians or whatever, or is the goal to wipe out the state of Israel, which seems to be the case for so many, with right now with Iran and again, that's a whole geopolitical thing. But there's a movement afoot to the anti-Zionist movement. To me, is a movement to destroy the country, and its impact on the Jewish people is enormous, potentially. And I suspect that you're going to go. There's nuance about anti-Zionist positions, but I'm going to the ultimate. The ultimate movement by Hamas and the enemies of Israel, who are seeking getting their allies on campuses and beyond in North America. Goodness, we've covered the gamut on so many topics here.
Yes. I'd actually like to address the Jewish left a little bit more.
Please.
We had a conference on the Jewish left that was put on by one of my colleagues last May. My husband was able to attend a lot of it remotely. I couldn't. I had a job interview going on actually for a candidate we were going to hire. Okay. He said a lot of the speakers were not only anti-Zionist, but bordering on anti-Semitic. It was a disturbing event for him to watch. The colleague that put it on is planning another one in February. So they're trying to get the Elie Wiesel Center to support it. They're trying to get the Jewish Cultural Endowment to fund it. I have big hesitations. I need to learn a lot more about it. I think the organizer actually learned from last year's, and it will be much more nuanced.
Yeah.
However, he had a tremendous response to this conference. They were having it in a room that only held 100, and it registered out immediately. They ended up in a room that held 250. It filled. They had another 250 online from all over the world. So there's a lot of interest in the Jewish left. Why? One of the major reasons is because Jews have been excluded from the left because of anti-Semitism for a long, long time. And so there is this generation of Jews that wants to establish the left for themselves, which I understand that. And I dare anyone to tell me I can't be part of the Jewish left because I'm a Zionist, right? And they might try to tell me that. I don't know. Yeah. I'm actually really resentful of people telling me and assuming things about my own political positions because I'm the director of the center and because I'm the head of this working group.
Right. Well, right. Since 2021, I've been, arguing, probably before that, but since 2021, when the first Hamas war, the previous Hamas war happened in, I think it was May 2021, and we saw an outpouring of of anti-Semitism there. It didn't spike as much as now, but it spiked. And what I thought would happen was that Jews of the left would demand a seat at the table and go, no, I am of the left, because so many Jews are. Well, I am of the left, and Israel is part of my life, and I don't want to be thrown out of this group because of this ideology. And it's wrong because ... fill in the blank. And I didn't see enough, my perspective, I didn't see enough of that happening. I saw a lot of people being, going, okay, I also, I'm critical of Israel. And they thought that was the litmus test for acceptance. And I think that they went a little too far with that. And, but I love the idea that you're saying, bigger tent, fight for you didn't say in those words, but I'm going to paraphrase it, to fight for your right to be at the table. Or to demand a spot at the table in some way. Am I right? Would you?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay.
You have to make space for Jewish left Zionists too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he is very excited about this new movement because it's growing quickly in the United States. A Jewish left that's anti-Zionist, mostly, from what I can tell.
So going back to the university as itself and and having room, having a spot at the table. There's something that I forgot to ask you earlier to look at, and that is these students who are entering university, Jewish students who are entering universities. And I know personally parents and students who have been looking at, what list they should be applying to and changing that list depending on what they've seen in terms of the hostility towards Jews and Israel. And I remember you and I have had a discussion about this, and I thought what you had to say was really interesting. Can you share that? I don't know if you remember where I'm going with this, but the idea of like let me phrase it another way. How should
Oh, yes.
you said something about how when evaluating whether to send your kid to a school, it's not just the anti-Semitism that's there. There are other things to consider. Can you
Yes.
expand on that or explore?
Yes, I do remember now that conversation. Right. So, first of all, I know parents who have decided not to send their kids to Columbia and they're looking at yeshiva instead.
Yeah.
And that's happening in Brandeis, definitely.
Okay.
And BU, I think, to a certain degree, because BU does have such strong support for Jewish students between the Center for Jewish Studies and a very strong Hillel. So the parents need to consider not only the absence or presence of anti-Semitism, but the support for Jewish students. So if they send them to a university that has very few Jewish students and not so many problems with encampments, etc., how are the students going to flourish Jewishly if there aren't the support systems?
That's huge.
Question. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, and I remember when you and I had this conversation just like that some months ago. I thought that was, I don't want to say mind blowing, but it was oh, that is so true. That is so true. And look, I'm a Montrealer. I live in Portland now, but I'm a Montrealer, and I went to visit this past summer, and things have gotten a lot worse for the Jewish community in so many ways. There have been so many attacks and all that. And I loved being there in the Jewish community when I was there. There's such a strength of support, a strength of Jewish peoplehood, a strength of Jewish community on so many fronts. I don't want to go into all that. It's not about Montreal, but that idea of, hey, what makes Montreal great for the Jewish community? Well, there's anti-Semitism, and it's gotten worse, but you've got this, and you don't have that kind of strong Jewish community in every city across North America. So similarly, with universities, it bears keeping that in mind. When making a decision about universities, don't ignore. I would say it sounds like what you're saying as well. Don't ignore the anti-Semitism. Factor it in, but also examine, look at it carefully from not both sides, but how much support. What kind of Jewish environment would this person be in? Just because there's anti-Semitism doesn't mean it's going to be in this person's face the entire time. And how can they weather the storm if they're not held up by some sort of support system?
Exactly. If they have safe havens, it makes a very big difference.
Okay.
That's right. Boston University has the largest Jewish population of any university in the United States.
Really?
Brandeis has a larger percentage, but we have a larger number.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's a big university, and I think it's about 25% Jewish.
Okay.
It's fairly hefty numbers. One reason that my husband and I decided pretty much that we're really comfortable in Brookline, Massachusetts right now is because Brookline, which is right next to Boston, also has a very large Jewish population, although, the anti-Semites think it's all Jews when it's 25%. But anyway, lots of synagogues, Jewish stores. We feel comfortable and safe there.
Yeah.
And we don't feel like that in some other places.
Right. No, I understand. Nancy, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with? Well, I'll ask you a question. Is the anti-Semitism is worse post-October 7th? You've mentioned that. You've also mentioned that you've got this working group addressing it. You don't have a crystal ball. You're as a professor, you deal a lot with the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the Holocaust, the writings of people from the past. But for a moment, indulge me in a crystal ball. Is there light at the end of this tunnel? Are we moving in the right direction as a society? These are big questions. Take it whichever way you want and answer it any way you'd like.
So I have to say that as a professor of Holocaust studies, I was really depressed after October 7th because it felt like the Holocaust was landing in my lap again.
Right.
genocide, mass murder, etc. Since then, I have cheered up somewhat, despite all the encampments, despite all the anti-Semitism, because we have a lot more allies now.
Ah,
And the allies keep joining forces, frankly. I
amazing.
sometimes meet with a colleague who's of a completely different ethnic origin, and they say really positive things to me. We've been thinking about you. Do you feel safe? This sort of thing.
Wow.
So there is a lot of that going on, and we need to embrace that, and we need to continue to reach out to our allies and create new allies.
I appreciate that so much. And it's when you're in a tunnel, it's hard to see the light, and it's easy to talk. Look, I say tunnel, echo chamber might be the better word right these days. We connect with each other, we wallow in our misery, and sometimes it's hard to see something from a different perspective. And you've talked about, if there was one theme that came throughout a lot of our conversation here, it's about having these different perspectives and listening to other people to balance things, or to at least be aware.
Let me add one more little thing, which is
Yes.
that one way that I've put it with my classes and with the upper administration is we need to learn to sit with difference, to sit comfortably with difference,
Hmm.
and really listen to each other. And that's not easy,
Yeah.
especially when passions are so inflamed as they are right now, but it's absolutely necessary if we want to create civil discourse.
This has been a lovely conversation, Nancy. Professor Nancy Harrowitz from Boston University. Thank you so much for being my guest today on Proudly Jewish.
Thank you.